PHP sessions. So in PHP, a session is a way to store the data that can be used across multiple requests from the same user. The sessions allows you to store data on the server and associate it with a particular user so that you can retrieve it on subsequent requests. Okay, so so you can see here when the user visits a web page, the user's sessions, a unique user ID is generated for that particular user. The session ID is now stored as a cookie in the user's browser, right? Or sometimes it can be passed as a URL parameter if the cookies are not enabled, right? The session ID is used to associate a subsequent request from the same user with the same session. Okay, so you can see that the cookie is passed, the session ID is passed, then can actually interact with the session, the web browser with the same session ID. So there are some basic steps for using sessions in PHP. Step 1 is we need to start the session using a session start function. So this function should be called at the beginning of each PHP script that needs to access the session data. If a session has already been started, this function will resume the existing session. Okay. So, and we can store the data in the session using $session super globals array. So so you can see here I have explained that. So here is session start, the session is passed, session ID is passed as a part of parameter here. So the session super globals array actually saves the session data. So this array can be used to store any type of data including arrays and objects, right? So session ID is a kind of a random alphanumeric string. It looks like this. So what actually happened when the session when the session start function activate, it actually create a text file on the web server that is the same name as the session ID preceded by SESS. Session ID text file are stored in the web server directory specified by the session.savepath directive in your php.ini configuration file. The session start function does not accept any arguments, nor does it return a value that you can use it on the script. It's just generate the session ID, right? And remember, we must call the session start function before you send the web browser any output. So if a client's web browser is configured to accept cookies, as I mentioned before, the session ID is assigned to a temporary cookie name PHP SES SID or session ID. Then pass the session ID as a query string or hidden form field to any web pages that are called as part of the current session. The session state information is accessed using, as I mentioned before, this session super globals, right? This is an array. So this array can be used to store any type of data, right, including arrays and objects. When the session start function is called, PHP either initialize a new session superglobals or retrieve any variables for the current session based on the session ID into this session superglobals. So this is an example of the session. So we start the session set. So we set the cookie parameter of 3600 seconds. Then we start the session, and then here I'm assigning session kind of values actually to the session superglobals, right? So in this example, as I mentioned, I start the session. I set the uh, this session to be exist for 3600 seconds, and I assign values to keys in the session super global array. So these are the keys and I assign the values, and then I have a hyperlink as a paragraph uh, which create the session ID. Okay, in this link. So session ID is a unique ID. So what I can do now is once I start the session, and then I can in my PHP file I can see whether the session exists, right? So make sure that you session start first, and then I use the isSet function to ensure the variables of the session are already there. So if is set the session first name and the session last name, and session occupation exists, so we perform this. And then the next important thing is deleting a session. We usually step one is start the session, and then we can use the array construct to reinitialize the session, and then use the session destroy to delete the session. So usually, as mentioned here, this piece of code you often use in a logout script. So if you are trying to write a script for the login logout, so usually this part is in the logout script, or sometimes the code can be included in the registration login page, so that we can delete the existing user session whenever the user opens it.